Welcome back to Behind the Spacebar, episode 12, Real Musicians Don't Use Tracks. Hey everybody, this is Will Doggett. Behind the Spacebar is a podcast for folks that are playback techs, musicians, music directors, worship leaders, really anyone using Ableton Live on stage in a live performance environment. Now, today's going to be a really fun episode. I want to address two different audiences that I think are listening to this. One, probably the primary audience, the people I just named, are folks that are bought into the idea of using tracks. You're already there, you're using tracks, you've used tracks, or you want to use tracks. Like, you know that this is what you should be doing. The second audience, which I think is probably in the minority of folks listening to this, but I think it's possible, is folks that are trying to figure out if they should use tracks. Is it worth it? Trying to figure out if they should use click. Or maybe you're even someone who is very resistant to the idea. You're very, you don't want to do it. Almost to the point of being militant about it. You think it's wrong. You think it's faking. You think it's destroying modern music as we currently know it. And you've Googled, ammunition to share with your band leader, to share with your fellow band members that want to use click, and you're looking for a reason why not to. I want to address both of you up front really quickly. The next 20, 25 minutes or so is kind of going to be a giant counseling session, because I want to break down that statement. I want to promise one thing to those of you that are on the fence about using clicks and tracks. This episode is not meant to demean you. It's not meant to say you're stupid for saying real musicians don't use tracks, or it's not meant to say, I'm not even going to try to convince you should use tracks. Let me go so far as to say that. And for those of you that are using tracks already, you're bought in, you're sold on the idea. I get it. I want you to still stick around and listen, because there's going to be some of the folks that are in your band that are not sold on the idea. You're going to transition to a new band where they're not playing with click. You're going to want to bring that in as a drummer, and they're going to be pushback and hesitancy towards that. And this is an argument you're probably going to hear. The goal of this, I think, on both sides is for us to hopefully learn to be empathetic towards the other view of this, right? This is what we need more of in the world. But again, my goal is not to demean you, and my goal is actually not to convince you should use tracks in this episode, okay? Which is maybe a wild thing for Ableton Live certified trainer and someone who owns a company that teaches people how to use tracks on stage. It's maybe a weird goal, weird thing to start with. But I want to break down this statement quite a bit up front here, just for a few moments, because I've heard it in a lot of different forms. Typically it's the real musicians don't use tracks. Recently I did a video, not recently, I mean, this was years ago. I did a video with my buddy Jonathan, and we broke down his particular tracks rig and setup that he was using with the band he works with. But recently, that's where the recent came in. Someone left a comment on that video, and I believe I left it up. I don't think I deleted it, because I don't think there's a need to delete that. But someone left a comment that said, man, I remember when people used to play their instruments live on stage. Like, and essentially the heart of that is, I remember when people used to just step on stage and play music, I've heard this in different forms or fashions. I remember early on, I don't know how long ago this would have been, maybe 2008, 2009, graduating college, working in a small church. And I remember we had a drummer come in to audition. And when I showed up to that church, the band I was in college, and most every band since 2004 that I played with had played with click. We were used to that. We were using in-ears. We were used to playing with click. I showed up to this smaller church, and they were trying to transition to using click. And so this drummer came into audition, and I remember he started the song off, and the song that he started it probably 20 BPM too fast. And so my buddy Harrison stopped the drummer, and he said, hey, actually, we just need to slow it down a little bit. And actually, we're starting to play with click. So I'm going to just start the click here at, whatever it was, 80 BPM, so we can follow. And he goes, no, he said, I don't play with click. And Harrison was kind of caught off guard. And I was sitting a couple seats away. I wasn't auditioning. I wasn't in the band, and I wasn't leading that particular band. I was just kind of observing his audition. And the guy said, yeah, I don't play with click. And he used this phrase. And this was maybe the first time I heard this phrase used, was he said, yeah, real musicians, real drummers don't use click. And what was funny is in the list of drummers and bands that he listed off as what he would consider real musicians, real drummers that don't use click. I knew a few of those people personally, and I knew that they used click, they played with click live, and they played with tracks live. And so this drummer was very hesitant to it. And needless to say, he didn't make the band. And he didn't make the band not because he couldn't play with click. Although if that was a requirement of the band, he wouldn't have made it. But he didn't make the band because he didn't have the skill set. He didn't have the humility to say, or to understand, or the wisdom of understanding that he was resistant to click because he just couldn't play in time. Because when we asked him to slow it down and keep it consistent, he sped up and slowed down. And part of his argument at that time was that, the band should follow the drummer and the drummer leads things. And it's like, okay, I guess in a way I can understand that, but that's something that like the band leader or the bass player or keys player should say, not the person, not the drummer should say that, because the drummer is saying that because they can't play with a click. And again, my goal in all this is not to try to demean you if you think we shouldn't use tracks or whatever. But I've heard this statement a few different ways. Real musicians don't use tracks. You're cheating, you're faking it if you're using click and tracks on stage. And then again, like that guy who commented recently on that video that said, I remember back when people used to actually play instruments. So, again, thinking about this from two different audiences, you're coming into this conversation. You saw the episode title of this episode. You're coming into this with a bit of a bias on your own. I want us to try to, as best as we can. My buddy Doug used to always talk about, when you're playing in a band, it's almost like this out of body experience you should have. And Doug's a drummer, and he was teaching this primarily to drummers, but it should be this experience where you almost have an out of body experience where you see yourself playing with the band and you're focused on what the overall experience is, the overall sound is, as opposed to being honed in and focused on you as a drummer and making you sound as good. Like, that's not your goal in a band. The goal in any band is to play your individual part, your individual piece, to make the whole thing sound really well. That's what I'm kind of hoping and praying you get out of this episode. No matter which of those camps you're in, we can kind of do this out of body experience where we hopefully maybe understand the other person's experience a bit. Right. So I want to start here. I think it's worth a basic understanding of what click and tracks are, and what using them on stage means and implies. Because I think, in fairness to some people that are in the camp of not wanting to use click and tracks, comes from a lack of understanding what that actually means. And they may have actually been in context where, we'll talk about this in a second, where using click and tracks on stage is faking it. That's not a fun place to be. Like, I understand if your previous situation with using tracks was like, hey, stand on stage and actually this guitar solo, instead of you playing it, it's going to be in the tracks. Well, it's like, yeah, that's faking it. And I can understand having resistance to that as being a musician and someone who wants to play. I get that. But so let's kind of clarify what we're talking about up at the top. Using a click on stage is not faking it. Using a click on stage is a way to bring some consistency to your band, to bring consistency to tempo. It's a way to improve the experience for everyone in the audience listening. Using a click on stage opens up the possibility for you to use tracks on stage. And we'll talk about that in a second. It opens up the possibility for you to automate production elements. So as a small 4-piece band, you could walk into a club, walk into a venue, and have the fullness of sound as a 6 or 7-piece band, but you're only 4 people. You could have the production quality and level of someone playing at the stadium, a couple streets away, but you're in a small 500 cap like room, right? That's the ability that click gives you by playing with click. Now let's talk about tracks. Again, some people's perception of tracks is shaped by Milli Vanilli. It's shaped by Ashley Simpson on SNL. And they think using tracks on stage means someone presses play and you just kind of fake or parrot or lip sync and, kind of play your guitar thing, and then we walk off stage and that's it. That's a scenario. I mean, that happens. Let's be honest with ourselves. Maybe you're listening to this and you're in a band currently right now that's doing that. Maybe you've done that before with your band. I've heard from friends that went and did a TV show date, like the Today Show or something. And it's such a small amount of time that they just rolled in and they just said, hey, the playback tech's just going to play tracks, and you just kind of fake it. Again, I don't want to assign a value to that or judgment as to whether that's good or bad. I will say personally, I don't have interest in playing in a band like that. We could say that that's faking it. And I mean, let's be honest, you are faking it. If you're playing tracks and you're just standing on stage pretending you're playing, you are faking it. Again, I don't want to necessarily assign a judgment to that, because in a lot of those scenarios, The music and the musician is only one very small piece of the entire puzzle. In those scenarios, it's more about a show. It's more about an experience for the audience that's showing up. A lot of times you'll see like an act that's really just a singer, and then everything else is kind of tracked, and maybe they have a drummer or guitar player playing along or whatever. In a scenario like that and you're faking it, great, that's fine. But if you're in the second camp where you're unsure about this, you're hesitant to that, I want to let you know that most scenarios using click and tracks, people are not faking it. So to my buddy, well, he's not necessarily my buddy, but we could be buddies, that commented on that video that said, I remember the good old days when people used to actually play their instruments live on stage. I think you're probably being sarcastic. Like, I want to give you the benefit of the doubt. You're probably being sarcastic there. It's like a boom roasted, we're all going to go weep and cry and stop using tracks now. But there's a possibility that you just haven't done it, so you don't understand it. And I see that so often. We see that so often in the world that we want to resist. We want to squash. We want to keep down the things we don't understand. And if we just took a few moments to be empathetic and actually understand someone else's worldview, we'd go, oh, okay, I get it. I understand why. So I do think it's worth stating up front. And those of you in the other camp that are using click and tracks, you're like, well, duh, Will. But again, I want to think like, maybe you think using clicks and tracks is faking because that's what you've seen. Maybe you've experienced that before. I want to let you know that's not always the case. Often, again, using click keeps the band together. It's a better experience for the drummer. Listen to, and I'm going to make a note to link to our click track episode where I kind of walk through how to convince your band to use a click no matter what context you're in. That's a very useful tool, a great way to improve the sound of your band. But when we talk about using tracks, that can come in all various forms, fashions. It could be you don't have a bass player, and so everyone in the band is playing to click, and the bass is in the tracks, right? And again, you could say that's faking it. That's very possible, but you don't understand the situation as to why there's no bass player. Maybe they can't afford to find a bass player. Maybe the bass player's out sick. Whatever it is, that's their situation. Maybe it's a full band, bass, drums, guitar. There's no keys, and they put pads, they put piano stuff in the keys part. They add some tambourine to add some percussion elements. They add some like drum loop percussion things. And then they add some string stuff to kind of elevate the sound. They add some sound effect things like sub basses, like drum hits that kind of enhance what's happening. In that moment, it's important to understand. Again, you could say that's faking it, and that's fine. We'll get to that in a second. You could say you believe that's wrong because there's something that we're hearing that's not on stage. You'd be surprised at the amount of bands that you see on TV or go visit that almost all of them, I would say 98% of them, if you go to a stadium show anywhere, are using tracks. Even the ones that you feel like are very raw and authentic or whatever are probably using tracks, but that's a whole nother conversation for another day. But in that situation and scenario, everyone that's playing instruments on stage is playing their instruments, and they do not have their instrument represented on the tracks, if that makes sense. So if I'm playing guitar, it's not like I have guitar in the tracks and I'm faking it. Sometimes you can, again, but in this scenario, we're talking about this hypothetical scenario. Everything that's in the tracks is representing something that can't in the moment be represented by the folks that are on stage, right? Most scenarios where people use click and tracks, that's what we're talking about. Most scenarios, people are not standing on stage faking that they're playing a guitar solo and you hear the guitar solo in the tracks. Most of the time, they're using tracks to fill out their sound. They're using tracks to add an extra level of polish to represent what happened on the CD and the record, to present a different kind of sound. They're using extra sounds to add to what's happening on stage, okay? So again, if you're listening to this and you're in that camp of we shouldn't use tracks, I'm hesitant towards it, I'm trying to figure it out, the first thing I want you to understand is what actually are using clicks and tracks, right? It's not people faking it on stage. It could be. It's people that are using those additional sounds to fill out what they're doing, okay? So I hope you understand that. Now, number two, should we do that or should we not? It all comes down to context. And this is a story I've told many times before, so if you've heard this before, I apologize. But one of my favorite music concerts, music experiences I've ever been to was years ago with my wife and I. We went to see probably my favorite jazz guitarist, favorite guitarist of all time, John Pizzarelli, and went to see him and his trio perform. And it was upright bass, piano, and John. If I remember correctly, there was no drummer. I think that's right. Yeah, because, well, that's three people. So yeah, duh, it's a trio. But it was an incredible experience. John's an amazing entertainer, amazing singer, amazing guitar player. The rest of the band was incredible. I showed up to that concert. I loved it. I walked out. I was incredibly happy. It was well worth the money. Again, amazing musicianship, amazing musician. Now, what would have happened if I walked into there? It was a trio, and they said, hey, let's give these people their money's worth. So we're going to track some drum stuff. We're going to have some string things. We're going to have tambourine, and we're going to sync all of our lights to this. That would have been a room full of people going, what the heck is happening right now? Like, we came to see a jazz trio, and I'm hearing all these sounds and all these different things. Same thing for me seeing Larry Carlton when he was on his, I think it's Sapphire Blues, that blues album that he did, tour, and was in North Carolina, still living in North Carolina. Went to go see him play. And it was this amazing experience with amazing musicians playing live in the moment off of each other, and guitar solo, keys solo, bass solo. It was just amazing experience. Well, if I had walked into that and Larry's like, guys, do we have a show for you? Check out the visuals that we've got going on here. I would have said, what the heck is happening? Right? Like, this is awful. This is not what I paid money to see. But then I think of Roger Waters. You think of Roger Waters' The Wall, the tour that he's on. I've never seen him live, but I've seen tons of videos and DVDs of him performing live, doing these classic Pink Floyd songs, doing his original songs. And the visuals are just unbelievable, right? In that moment, the context makes sense, but you see an airplane going over the audience and you hear an airplane. That would be really weird if you saw an airplane going over the audience and Roger said, there's no airplane sound because I'm a real musician and I don't play with click and tracks, right? In fact, that tour would not be possible, would not exist without click and tracks, right? The sound effects happening would not exist without click and tracks. So those are three different scenarios. The thing that's important to understand here is context. If I go to see a jazz trio, they better not be playing with tracks, right? I don't care that there's not a drummer. I don't want to hear a drummer in that context. I want to hear those musicians in that moment respond to what's happening. Maybe there's a scenario again where it's a jazzy context. It's a blues concert. Maybe it's even a rock concert, but it's just, 5 musicians on stage playing together in the moment. It makes sense. It sounds great. But then if I go to that situation where I want a big experience, I want a big, go from just a show to a full experience. I want to be entertained. I want to be overwhelmed with the visuals, impressed with the visuals, with the lights. I hope they use click and tracks there. And in fact, this is pre-pandemic, so it was a couple years ago, but my wife and I went to go see and the kids were with us. It's here in Texas. Went to go see a lineup of a couple different bands. I want to say there were 3 or 4 bands on the ticket. And there were 3 opening bands and then kind of the headliner. Well, the headliner got up. It was just kind of straight ahead rock music, but they had that tracks. Obviously, they had visuals synced, videos synced, lights synced, and it was good. It was a great experience. The band was good, visuals are great. But then as I walked back through the opening acts, the very first opening act was good. The music was good, but they had lights, they had some visuals and things. And it was like super entertaining. It was good. In fact, it was a band I had heard before on the radio, but never seen live. And I never really loved the band, but then I saw them live and I thought, hey, this is pretty good. Then he was the second or third act. I can't remember who it was again, kind of a rock band, but they came out. They clearly were not playing to click. They clearly were not using tracks, and they just kind of played their instruments, and they were good. But it was a situation where I went, I've worked with enough bands. I've been in enough bands that I imagine that conversation kind of went like, man, we want to just flow. We want to be real musicians, no clicks, no tracks. We just want to stand on stage and just like rock out and have fun. And I will say, the experience to me as someone who was watching from the audience was, the band that was, skill level maybe was here, but was using tracks. The overall experience was great. The band whose skill level I think was a little higher. They were better musicians, but the type of music they were playing would have benefited from some extra pad sounds, some extra percussion things, playing to click so that their tempo was pretty consistent, because the songs in the studio were recorded to click and were meant to be consistent, and then playing live without click and without the tempos being consistent didn't make the experience any better for me in the like sitting in the audience, right? So it's all about context. Playing with clicks, playing with tracks is not cheating. I think we're good with that. I think we understand that. Some scenarios it is. Just don't go to those shows and you're going to be good. 2, if you should use click or tracks is all about context. What's your goal? What are you going for? If the context makes sense, then consider using clicks and tracks. The third thing I want to say on the back of that, and we talked about this with clicks, again, that whole idea of real musicians don't use tracks. I want to make it super clear. And again, this is like maybe being a little more obvious. I think when we say this, we understand it, but playing with a click, playing with tracks does not make you a bad musician. What makes you a bad musician is being a bad musician. In the same way, not playing with click or not playing with tracks doesn't make you a bad musician either. And let's take that a step further. A bad musician playing with click and tracks is a bad musician. A good musician playing with click and tracks is a good musician. A good musician not playing with clicks and tracks is a good musician. So I want to make that super, super clear to us that using click, using tracks is not faking it. It doesn't immediately take your skill level down. Like, I think that's important to understand. And I have to ask for you, if you're in that second camp and you've never done it, I have to ask for your trust a little bit here, that you've got to understand, as someone who spent years doing that, and as someone who teaches and trains musicians and bands and artists how to incorporate this, you just got to trust me. But if you haven't done it, you've got to trust me that using a click doesn't immediately make you a bad musician. The same way that amplifying your guitar and using an electric guitar and an amp doesn't make you any worse of a musician than someone who just plays an unamplified acoustic. I see it the same way. I see it the same argument. It would be like an acoustic player, crossing their arms and being at a concert where people are using electric guitars and going, those guys aren't real musicians. And you're like, that doesn't really make sense. It doesn't make them less of a musician by amplifying their guitar. Well, it's the same thing. Using click and tracks doesn't make you less of a musician because you're using a click and track. Like, you're a good musician because you're a good musician. Here's where I want to start to wrap up. So it said we go about 25 minutes here. Here's what I'm gonna wrap up. I'm going to talk to the folks that are resistant to that just for a moment. And I said, I don't want to shame you. I don't want to make you feel bad, but I do want to share one thing with you in particular. Here's where I really want to encourage you. If you are resistant to using click and tracks because you're unable to play with a click, let's go back to that story I talked about at the beginning. That drummer who came in and said, well, you should follow the drummer. Real musicians don't use click. He was saying that out of insecurity because he couldn't play in time. Forget the click. He just couldn't play in time. So adding a click to that only highlighted his lack of ability to play in time, keep a consistent tempo. Again, you could say, well, music should ebb and flow. Great. Maybe it should. It's all context, but can you play to a click and tracks? That's a skill. So here's what I want to encourage you. If you're resistant to the idea, and your resistance and the reason you comment on YouTube videos and say, I remember when people used to actually play their instrument, is because you are lacking the ability, the skill to play with a click, to play in time. I would encourage you to learn that skill. I would encourage you to say, I don't prefer playing with click and tracks because it's not the type of music I enjoy. I enjoy bands that just get together and play music. Again, I would give you a little bit of context here. A lot of the bands you go see that you love, that you're probably holding up as people that are like the real musicians, they're using click and tracks. I can almost guarantee you they're using click and tracks. Depends on context. But I want you to maybe stop saying, yeah, real musicians don't use tracks as a way to deflect the fact that you don't yet have the skill to play with click and tracks. Now, do you want to have that skill? I think if you're a band that you're asking people to pay money to come hear you play, I think you should learn that skill, because I think if the context makes sense, it improves the experience for the people in the audience. And the act of playing music should be a selfless act, and it's an act of service, and it's an act of making it the best experience for the people that come in. And again, if the best experience for the people coming in to see you necessitates you playing with a click and using tracks, I would encourage you to learn that skill. But if you have no interest in that, and your usage of music is it's something fun for you to do on the weekends, then do that. Again, my goal is not to convince you to use tracks in this episode. My goal is to hopefully help each side understand the other side a little better. It's about context. If it makes sense, if your goal is to provide the best experience for the audience, then yes, please consider using click and tracks. Consider using click and automating your production stuff. It can make a better experience for you as well as the people listening. But again, if you don't yet have that skill level, consider getting it, but please stop using the real musicians don't use tracks excuse or statement to deflect your lack of ability and skill. Okay. I hope that makes sense. Let's talk to the folks that are using tracks as we wrap up here. My encouragement to you is really think about how you're using tracks. Think about your context. Are you in a situation where, let me talk to worship leaders for a minute. This podcast episode is not geared to worship leaders and folks doing this in church, but I want to talk to you guys for a moment. Are you in a situation where you are allowing someone to stand on stage and fake it, or allowing someone to stand on stage unprepared, and you're using tracks as a crutch because this person doesn't know piano well enough, and you say, oh, it's fine, just play pads and I'll put the piano stuff in the tracks? I think that's fine if your goal for your band is to give people a place to serve, and that's it. If that's your goal, then that's great. But if your experience for your band, your goal for your band is, yes, give people a place to serve, but also give them an opportunity to grow in their musicianship. Even if you are in a church setting, you're in a church context, that should be part of the equation. If you're doing anything with music, I don't think it should be, let me lower the bar so much that anyone can be involved, and we'll just supplement and we'll fill in by unmuting the electric guitar parts. I've heard multiple stories. I've yet to see this live, but I've seen multiple stories of people doing Miraculum. And again, if you're a worship leader, you get that at Christmas time for their Christmas show, and they're just turning on the guitar part and the guitarist is, faking or whatever. And please don't do that. Have enough integrity as a church to serve your people well, to push them, to encourage them, or tell them maybe it's not time right now. There's a reason, you let those people be on stage and fake that they're playing, but you're not going to let them get up and teach, if they're not a good teacher. So think about that. That's one particular context. But again, let's take it out of the church thing. Let's expand it. Anyone using clicking tracks on stage, look at your context and go ask the question, should I be using clicking tracks? Does my context necessitate it? You may be going, oh, we don't have a drummer, we're just a trio, but we can track the drums and it's going to be better for the audience. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's better that you just play acoustic guitar and sing as a singer-songwriter. Maybe it's better that you're just a jazz trio and people enjoy that and it's nice. But maybe you're in a situation where you're relying on tracks not as a way to give you a fuller sound, not as a way to enhance the experience for the people listening, but maybe you're using tracks as a way to work around your laziness or work around your bad musicianship. Use that as a way, use that as a way to go, man, I need to be a better guitar player. I need to come prepared to band rehearsal. I need to do this so that the sake of me and all the other folks that I'm standing on stage with, we all have a better experience. We can stand on stage with integrity. Man, this was a heavy episode as I'm wrapping things up. And again, my goal is I don't want you to feel like I'm sitting in a lofty tower looking down at the peasants and saying, this is the standard in which you should live on. I hope maybe you listen to this and it gives you some freedom to go, we shouldn't be using clicking tracks. It doesn't match our context. We don't have the musicianship yet to do that. We need to focus and work on musicianship before we work on using clicking tracks. Maybe that's where you are as you're listening to this, and that's fine. Maybe you're someone who has been resistant to it and you're kind of feeling that like tap on the shoulder that you're like, man, I'm resistant to it because I've never done it. And two, I don't have the skill yet to play to play consistently in time. That's a musicianship thing. Like just practice, get that metronome, start practicing, and you're going to be good to go. Here's where I want to wrap up though, is if you are looking for some resources, some ways to learn how to play with clicking tracks better, head to fromstudio2stage.com/free. And I've included the link right below this video. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, wherever, it's in the show notes. I have a bunch of free resources there. In fact, these resources, if I were to sell them, would cost hundreds of dollars. And in fact, many of them are generated from products I sell that cost hundreds of dollars, but they're free to you. And it's a way to say, one, thank you for listening to this episode. Thanks for watching this episode. But two, to help you go further faster, to help you figure out how to integrate clicking tracks in a way to grow your skill level, your musicianship, to be able to do that. So if that's something you're interested in, head to fromstudio2stage.com/free. Check out all the free resources there. You can add your name, your email there, and download those instantly. Thanks so much for hanging out on Behind the Spacebar. I hope this episode wasn't a downer. I hope it was an encouragement to you, either to evaluate using clicking tracks in a different light, to stop using clicking tracks, or just to understand the other viewpoint and other side a little better. I hope it was beneficial. Let me know in the comments if it was. Even if you're frustrated with me and angry about something I said, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear that as well too. And if you've enjoyed it, do me a favor, like, subscribe, leave a review, rating review on iTunes, wherever you're listening, Spotify. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week, Monday, 10 a.m. Central, on the next episode of Behind the Spacebar. Take care, everybody. Bye.